preventing a looming war in the Middle East while delivering justice for the nearly 3,000 Americans killed on 9/11 would be a big ask for anyone. Mitch Rapp isn't just anyone. Thank you for joining me on the Jack Carr Book Club. In this episode, I sit down with Don Bentley to discuss his new book, Vince Flynn's Capture or Kill. Awesome, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
New chapter in your life opened with what you're doing right now, authoring the latest Mitch Rapp thriller. And I want to get to that, but why don't we just dive in with a couple things that I don't usually do, but I think it would be kind of fun to start off this way. And who is your favorite literary villain?
Oh man, that's a good question. Favorite, you know what? This is gonna be a kind of a standard answer probably, but I'm gonna go with Hannibal Lecter. That one like still freaks me out at night. And Jodie Foster did such a great job in the movie and stuff as well. But man, Hannibal Lecter is the man.
Yeah. No, people who have not read the book should go back and either read it again or read it for the first time, because I read it in high school. So right around, probably because of the movie, I'm guessing. But yeah, a fantastic book. It's on one of my reading lists, one of the earlier reading lists, actually. And if you could spend one day with any author, living or dead, and you cannot pick Vince Flynn, who would it be? What would you do?
Come on, man.
Here we go. Yeah.
So I'm gonna mess up his name because I do British names horribly, but I finally read the HMS Ulysses, and so the first one of Alistair MacLear, am I getting this right? Ice Station Zebra. McLean, there you go. That book, like I had read a bunch of his ones after that, and being a kid, I remember, Where Eagles Dare with Clint Eastwood and everything. And I'd never read the beginning one. And I was like, it's his first novel. It's going to be like, that book moved me. It was incredible. And it was all on a single destroyer, right? There's no jumping from place to place. The cast of characters he really doesn't describe much physically anyway. And so, it took me a while even to sort through the names and figure out who was who. But the ending of that book, they have their battle ensign up and they're charging full steam towards this German ship. Like, it was incredible. And you could see how that guy became the master of the genre and really broke open military thrillers. Or I don't even know if they called his military thrillers at the time, but certainly before Clancy and any of those other folks, he broke that genre open.
Yeah, and you can read it in an afternoon, essentially. Yeah. But most of the books of his that I have, they're not that long. Like, you can get through them fairly quickly. It seems like they're in this, whatever they called the genre back then, where it was just thrillers or whatever they may have called it back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of them aren't that thick. You can get through them in for sure a day if that's all you had. But a couple of days for sure. And actually, I have the whole stack. As I walked up here into my library, I had Mystery Mike track down all the old paperbacks of his. So for old school, you have all that amazing cover art. So they're all just right around the corner on the stairway on the way up here. So those are all there. And the old covers are just awesome.
And if you like that genre, there's a guy, Tom Colgan turned me on to, who still writes, and his name's P.T. Duderman, and he writes these series of World War II novels that all take place, naval novels, all take place in the Pacific right as the Allies are doing the island hopping. And he brings home the terror that was the kamikazes in a completely different way. I remember watching the old black and white war films and stuff like that and seeing it, but he was a naval officer before he was a writer. And just there's a nonfiction book called The Tin Can Navy that talks about the destroyers in World War II, and he builds on that, fictionalizes it, and takes some actual events. But that's another kind of still in that genre, that World War II kind of genre.
Nice. And what's on your nightstand, desk, coffee table right now?
So I actually have the new book by Ward Larson that is called Vector, and it is phenomenal. So another, you and I are about the same age. Another fantastic, also Clint Eastwood '80s movie was Firefox, and this book is like the spiritual successor to Firefox. So another, this incredible like Russian defects with this crazy military, crazy plane developed with the Chinese and the Russians to be the next generation stealth fighter, and crash lands, and the CIA has to send in a guy to try and get him out. And it's really, really good.
Nice. I had that back in, I want to say fourth grade ish time frame when it came out. And I have the original paperback in the other room. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's like Clint Eastwood's on the cover of it. So he has his helmet under one arm. And I love all those. The covers that they did back then were just awesome.
Phenomenal.
What book have you read multiple times and why?
So I've read Vince Flynn books multiple times, and I'm assuming I'm not allowed to say that. I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. We're gonna get to Vince. We're gonna get to Vince in a second here.
I'm also a big fantasy fan, and yeah, I actually when I was working on my first book in high school, I kept going back and forth between writing a fantasy book or writing in the genre that I write now. And so there's an author that isn't, I think, super well known. His name is Greg Keyes, and he has a 4-volume book set that is, the first one's called The Briar King. And those are pretty phenomenal. Like, he does a great job. If you like epic fantasy, his characters are fantastic. Greg was a fencer, and so he has a character that's kind of this ne'er-do-well Italian fencer is one of them. And those books are pretty fantastic, really underrated series, and I've read them multiple times.
Nice. All right. And you can't choose Vince Flynn. You can Firefox, and you can't choose Silence of the Lambs. But what is your favorite film or book, TV adaptation? Book to TV film adaptation.
Book to TV. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit because I haven't read the books yet, but I love the Slow Horses show on Apple TV. Do you know this one? So it's
I watched episode 1, and I need to go back to it.
It's so good. So Gary Oldman is fantastic in that role, but it's much more, a lot of TV shows now rely, I think, too much on special effects and not enough on story. And this one is, like I said, I haven't read the books yet, but the first 2 seasons are phenomenal. And it has that old Le Carre kind of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy feel to it, but is in present day and kind of an MI5. The Slow Horses is a take on Slough House, where River House is where all the great guys and girls, the top-notch agents are, and then they have Slough House where all the losers go that are, one step of getting kicked out of MI5. And this book this series is about them, and Gary Oldman is their fearless leader, and it's really, really good.
Nice. And then are you a hardback reader, paperback reader, trade, or mass market?
Man,
audio.
So it's funny about audios because people, I think before you, because obviously you love Ray Porter and talk about him all the time, but there's another writer, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name now, but his first book in the series was called Patient Zero. And so he talked about how he loved Ray Porter so much that he started writing his books, and he would hear Ray's voice as he was writing it. And I didn't really get that until my first Clancy Target Acquired came out, and I heard Scott Brick do it. And I'm sure you, like me, it's really hard for you to read your own work. But for me, when I listen to it, there's enough distance there that you can enjoy it. And man, listening to Scott Brick bring books to life is just incredible. But I still love hardbacks, though I have to say Kindles are hard to beat from a convenience standpoint, because you can have that book right now. You just push the button and have it in there. But I still love hardbacks, but I'm getting to appreciate audiobooks a whole lot more.
Oh, nice. Yeah. The audiobooks are so, I mean, this fastest growing segment of publishing. And
Yeah.
Rick is amazing and such a great guy, too. Such
Yep.
an amazing narrator. And of course, Ray, I can't ever say enough good things about him. But it's still hard. I'm still a I mean, not a hardcover. I need a physical book, whether it's a hardcover, mass market, or whether it's a trade, but I need a physical book still. I still like that. And I cannot do the Kindle.
You don't have a Kindle at all? Like you don't do e-reader at all? Really?
It's
Huh.
well, yeah, behind me. I obviously like physical books, but it seems like I do so much work. So whether I'm writing the book or I'm returning
Yep.
emails or I'm doing another project, it's all on a screen. And so
Yep.
when I sit down with a book to read, I want to have that physical book and have it be different than
Yeah.
what I'm doing on my screen for work all day, and have that separation between the two, not a continuation of. If
Yep.
that makes
Yep.
sense.
No,
Yeah.
I can see that. I think though I get a lot of requests for blurbs. I imagine you get 3 times as many as I do. And what I like about Kindles is I can just highlight text as I'm going through and then download all those notes afterwards. And so I can look at what I liked about the book, things that were things, especially if I'm going to interview an author or something. So I do think I got to go up to Poison Pen here this last weekend and see Daniel Silva. And so I was reading, Barbara asked me to send her a couple questions as well. She's a phenomenal interviewer, but she's like, there was this guy named Jack Carr that you interviewed and you did a really good job. Could you send me some questions? And so I actually had his paper version. I was going through putting post-it notes on and trying to do it. And that was pretty phenomenal too. But I think Kindles are a whole lot easier when you have to read a book quickly and make notes and stuff.
Interesting. So I did the exact opposite. I read this
With no post-it notes. You're like, there's nothing in here I care about.
No, I got them all. I actually wrote them down as I went. Right here. So yeah, usually with fiction, I won't put too many notes in there. If it's nonfiction,
Yeah.
there'll be tons there because I want
Yeah. Yeah.
to get something like that. But this, I just want to love and enjoy the story for the story rather than pick
Yep.
parts. So I did it that way, and I had such a good time reading it. I'm going to get to that.
Thanks.
Last one of these before we move on to Capture or Kill. First book you can remember making a strong impact impression. Like what's that one from your youth or wherever it is along the way that really stands out as that one in your mind that helped forge your path, perhaps going forward.
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat a little bit on this one too, because it wasn't a book, but what's that?
Keep cheating on these.
I keep cheating. I know you've talked about how much The Most Dangerous Game meant to you, and that one was special to me too because I remember my dad telling me about it before I read it because he was a kid and read it and loved it. But the first one I remember reading that just blew my mind was maybe 6th or 7th grade, where I read Flowers for Algernon, and that story where it takes this protagonist and then completely changes them by the end, and you get that twist and you're like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And so I think that's when I was starting to write, like a lot of writers do, I wrote a bunch of short stories and none of them were very good. And I think that what makes short stories, when they're done well, so potent is that they have that ability to punch you in the face. You spend an hour or 2 hours maybe reading it, and at the end, it just grabs you and kind of claws your heart out. And Flowers for Algernon was certainly that for me.
Oh, wow. I have not read that, so I'm going to add that to my list. Read that very soon. All right, moving on to Capture Kill. So you have taken on Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn. You're moving forward. This is your first one right here, taking on Kyle, and who took over from Vince Flynn after he passed away.
Yep.
Before I get to how that happened, did you feel a pressure? Obviously, there's a responsibility there. What kind of picture of pressure and responsibility did you feel that may be different from when you're writing your own book? This is your Matt Drake's right here. What sort of pressure responsibility did you feel was different? Because that Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn fan base is so passionate. And it's not just about Mitch Rapp. It's about this guy. It's about Vince Flynn, legacy. And for whatever reason, you can sense that readers and now listeners have like a personal relationship with Vince Flynn
Yep.
that they might not have with other authors whose legacies have been continued through a continuing series after their dad. It's different for some reason with Vince Flynn, and I can't put my finger on exactly why that is, but it is, and because this is just a different kind of connection for whatever reason. But so, what was that mixture of pressure, responsibility, as you realized that you were now essentially the inheritor of this legacy?
Yeah, that's a great question because I've been fortunate enough to have written for another legacy series. So I wrote 4 books in the Clancy series, and that was a phenomenal opportunity. Clancy was the one who introduced me to that genre. For me, it wasn't Hunt for the Red October. I think the first book of his I read was actually Red Storm Rising, but um, it was different taking over for Mike Madden, who did a phenomenal job before I did, because there had been, you alluded to it, the only person who ever wrote in Vince's universe besides Vince was Kyle Mills, who did a fantastic job. In the Clancy universe, Tom Colgan, my editor at the time for both my books and the Clancy books, had done a phenomenal job of picking writers who were right for the series. And so from a fan perspective, nobody really cared that I was taking over, from the standpoint that I think the fans had enough trust in the Clancy estate and Tom Colgan as an editor that, it was kind of a blip on their radar. Okay, there's a new person doing it. And really a lot of that credit also goes to Mark Graney, who wrote with Tom when he was still alive, and then was the first writer to write after Tom passed away. With Vince, there were a couple things. So on a personal level, Vince is my favorite ever author. And so his book, Protect and Defend, which plays kind of heavily in Capture or Kill, was my favorite book of his series. And when I wrote 3 books that didn't sell before I wrote my 4th book, Without Sanction, that did. And when my second one or third one didn't sell, I actually took Protect and Defend, and we lived in a little house at the time. I didn't even have an office. And I note carded it all out, and I taped it to our bedroom wall, which my wife absolutely loved. But it was like my way of taking the guy who I thought was at the very top of his game in the genre I wanted to write, and try and like peek behind the curtain and figure out, how does he do what he does? Kind of the difference between looking at a house and looking at the blueprints of the house. And so just for me as a writer, like the opportunity to write in the universe that my favorite author in the world created was a big deal. The second thing is that, again, going back to how well Tom Colgan managed the Clancy estate, Tom was pretty much the decider. The Clancy folks certainly have to approve it, but Tom went out and picked the writers and said, here's who I think, and then the Clancy estate would approve it. And so it was a great experience, but you were also aware that the Clancy business universe is huge. There are movies, there are video games, there are the series of books that Putnam does. There's other series of books like Netgear and stuff like that other folks do. And so it's massive. And so it felt a little like joining a big corporation. The Flynn experience was 180 degrees out of that, where not only was it felt like I was interviewing for a job at the family business, and they were looking to bring you in with all of the trepidation that somebody who has built this business from scratch feels about bringing in an outsider to what has been the family business. And the other thing that struck me too is whether I talked to, so Emily Bestler, who's also your editor, is phenomenal editor. She was Vince's editor for all of his books when he was still alive, was Kyle's editor for all of Vince's books, and then was mine. So from Emily to David Brown, that was Vince's last publicist, to Sloan Harris, that was Vince's agent and still represents the Flynn estate, there was this sense that the person that you were going to write for was not an entity, was not this big conglomeration. It was a person named Vince Flynn, who they all still love very much. And so when they would talk about him, you could hear the emotion in their voice, or they would talk about funny Vince stories, and so it felt much much more personal to me for those reasons than the Clancy ones. And then from the fan perspective, like I said, I mean, and again, to Tom Colgan's credit, when I took over the Clancy one, it wasn't really a blip on anybody's radar. When they announced that Kyle and I were switching over, David Brown, the publicist, actually texted me and he's like, it's trending on Twitter right now because there were so many people that love that series. And the messages I got from the fans were supportive for the most part, but were all some variation of, this is my favorite series in the world. Do not screw this up. And so there was a lot of that where I had to think, at least for me, I don't know if you feel the same way when you're writing the first draft of the book, it feels very tenuous, and it's very easy to sit and compare something that's a work in progress to your last finished book and think, there's too big a disparity there. Like, I'm not doing enough, whatever that is in the draft. And then when you add the pressure of this being your favorite author in the world who is beloved by so many different people, and it was a lot. I had to get out of my own head a lot and just let the story grow. And so I think you and I might have talked about the details at a high level, but I was pretty guarded about them, which I normally am with works in progress anyway. But I just knew I couldn't take anybody else sitting on my shoulder and telling me what they thought of the book or not in that drafting process, because I felt like there were points where I was barely holding it together as it is, to think, is this going to be good enough? Is this, I got to dedicate the book to Vince. And so I've gotten to know his widow, Lisa, a little bit. She's a fantastic lady. And so I reached out to her beforehand and I said, hey, is this okay? Because here's why I want to dedicate it to Vince. And she's like, yes, absolutely. Please do that. And the dedication I put, like, I hope this book makes you proud, because I hope it does. Like, he is a literary hero of mine. These people all knew him. He was a man. I never got to meet him. And so I get to experience him through their stories. And it's kind of funny. David and Emily and Sloan all know now that when they talk to me, the last thing I'm going to do is say, can you tell me a Vince story? Because I think, number one, I want to know more about the man whose books I'm writing. And also as a fan, like, I love that. I love being able to look behind the curtain and hear what kind of guy he was. And so when you put that all together, it was, even though I was, like I said, I was fortunate enough to write for another legacy estate, it was a very different experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, yeah, my one Vince Flynn link up was at SHOT Show where we met up a few years ago, and at closing. So I stayed closing. He was signing for some booth there, and I stayed and talked to him after. Awesome. They shut down. Who has been to SHOT Show knows when you leave SHOT Show, it's like a mass, like crazy cattle call exit. Like, there's so many people working there. It can take a long time to get out of there. So yeah. There from a place kind of in the back of the show, all the way back out to that kind of palazzo area, outside of the convention hall area. And
that must have been amazing.
Yeah, and it was so cool to hear him. And I remember I asked him, do you ever wake up? And I was just listening. I was just kind of like, I was still in the military, well before I got out. And so I hadn't switched in my mind yet to author. I was still SEAL and obviously a reader. And I remember asking him, do you ever worry that someone's going to take term limits as a blueprint, and you're going to wake up one morning and open the set of paper at the time and see that someone has used that as a blueprint? And I never forget what he said. He said, every day. Yeah.
Yeah. If you read the author's note or the intro or something to term limits, he actually talks about how he made choices to change things, either about the White House, about the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that you could see even. And when he was writing that book, he was not Vince Flynn yet, right? He had some success with his first book, but he hadn't become an overnight superstar. And so, in some ways you think, he didn't know whether anybody was really going to read that book, how big it would be. And it still weighed on him, right? Like, it still weighed on him where he's like, I got to change some things. I got to make sure that I don't make it too easy for people. Which is, I think, again, just goes to tell you what kind of guy he was.
Yeah. It's probably transfer of power, right? So that he changed things up on with all the Secret Service TTP.
Yeah, transfer of power. That's what I was thinking, not term limits. Yeah, yeah. Term limits is a little more relevant right now, right? After the horrendous stuff that happened this weekend. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, what a great book. I love,
Yep.
maybe because it was the first one, and it introduced me to him. Maybe it was because I read it on the way to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It came into play, but obviously it stood out as a game genre changing book, one that moved the genre forward, wasn't just a continuation of something kind of that we'd seen before. It was
Yeah, and that was super gutsy too, I think, as a writer to go from term limits to transfer of power, right? Where you're going to take, the readers that he cultivated and such in term limits, there was no Mitch Rapp there, right? Like he introduces Mitch in transfer of power. And so again, he makes this kind of gutsy decision as a writer that's got one book under his belt, starting to get a little bit of success, and does this bam. And that's another one. I wish I could spend an afternoon with him and like walk me through how you decided to do that or what. I mean, it's crazy.
Oh man, what an amazing guy. So what were the mechanics behind this? Did you know that Kyle was thinking of moving on and you guys linked up? Or did you get a call from
So,
someone saying, "Hey, what do you think about taking this thing over?"
So I'm going to start by saying never, ever, ever play poker with Kyle Mills, because I was an FBI agent, had done some interrogations in my past, and that guy has a poker face that is impenetrable. And I'll come back to that story to explain how it fits. But the long and short of it is that I was getting to a point where I had written my fourth book, had written some Clancy books, and was trying to make some decisions as a writer and say, what am I going to work on next? I had was thinking about doing a standalone for my books. I was looking at the Clancy ones and was honestly praying about it and trying to figure out, what do I do here? Because I've taken this gamble on myself. I'm a full-time writer yet, but now the paths are kind of diverging and I'm not sure what to do. And as I was praying about it, I was thinking, if I could write a series, if I'm going to have to do or going to write a legacy series for a while, wouldn't it be amazing to write the Vince Flynn series? And so I had a call with my agent, Scott Miller, already scheduled to talk about something else. And so at the end of it, I'm like, hey, this is going to sound crazy, but, we're talking about what I should work on next. And the series I would love to write is the Vince Flynn series. And I'm like, I have no indication that they're looking for a replacement or anything like that. And he said, you know what? It's an agent's job to figure that out. So let me make some calls. And so he came back and said, that they are looking for someone. And they're willing to kind of include you in the process. So take that. That was right before I was supposed to go to Poison Pen and interview Kyle on his latest Vince Flynn book. And so when I originally asked Barbara from Poison Pen if I could come out, I'd never met Kyle before and was a big fan. And she's like, yeah, come out and interview him. And so as I'm there, we know each other a little bit. I think we'd actually met at BoucherCon just before that. And so we go out to dinner, and his wife, Kim, who's a fantastic lady, was there. And so Kim and Barbara are talking. And so Kyle and I are sort of talking, and I'm like, I'm going to use some FBI agent skills and see if I can figure out where he is on this process and what he's doing. And I did my best interrogation of Kyle and walked away and thought he has no idea that they are looking for another author and he's about to get fired. And so I came home. I couldn't sleep that night. I called my agent and I'm like, take my name out of this process. Kyle's getting fired. He doesn't even know about it. Like, I can't. I just spent the evening talking to him and his wife. Take me out of this. And he's like, slow your jets a little bit there. Let me make a call or two. And he came back and said, Kyle very much knows, and in fact came to him a year ago and said that they were looking for, that he was going to write one more book and was helping with the process. And so later, when I got the gig, I was like, "You lied to me for an hour. An hour. We sat there and lied to each other." And so that's the he was sworn to secrecy and honored that vow. And my FBI interrogation skills fell short that night. but never, never, never play poker with Kyle Mills. But so then once the process started, Emily Bessler and Sloan Harris, again, Sloan is still represents the Flynn family and the Flynn estate. Both of them read my books. I talked to both of them extensively, had several calls with Sloan. And that was like I said, that was just what kind of drove home how different this was. Just hearing them talk about Vince, what Vince meant in their lives, everything like that. And so it went for a while, and and I don't know who the other candidates were, and don't ask Kyle because he won't tell, or he'll lie to you if you do. And so, but it took a while. They did their due diligence, vetted me, vetted my books. I talked about kind of what I thought I would do for the first book and everything like that. And then eventually they came back and said, "You're the one we want." And it was still remember getting that call, still remember kind of pinching myself that I would get to do that. And then kind of, as you alluded to, then reality sets in, and it's kind of like, okay, you're the dog that caught the car, what do you do now? And that's where I found myself next.
Oh man. So since we're there, what were some of the things that you thought about when you're like, okay, wow, I've caught the car.
Yeah.
What you did was you went back over a decade.
I did.
Too much away because it says it in the the cover back in the description. But you went back, and was that from the outset? Was that something that you had you thought, oh, this might differentiate what I'm going to do from just a continuation? Or what was your thought process around going back over a decade to the events surrounding essentially May of 2011?
Yeah, so it was kind of a compilation of a couple things. So I was an FBI agent when the Bin Laden raid happened. I'd already gotten out of the military and I remember standing in my living room and seeing President Obama walk up to the podium and say, we killed Bin Laden. And my first thought it was one that's probably not appropriate to voice on this podcast, but it was like, we finally got that son of a gun. And then my second one close on that was, I wonder what Mitch Rapp had to do with this. And it was, I think like you've talked about reading while you were on deployment. When I was in Afghanistan, I spent a lot of time in Bagram, and they had certainly the library that was the official library, but everywhere you went, whether it was the gym, whether it was that people would have makeshift libraries there, right? Of just paperbacks or things. They'd leave books and take books. And a lot of them were Vince Flynn books. And I read a lot of Vince Flynn books in Afghanistan. And so in my mind, I think because of that, partly whenever Afghanistan and Vince Flynn were always kind of tied together for me. And so fast forward to where I'd caught in the car, and I had a couple thoughts. And so one was, certainly I want to, like Kyle has done an incredible job of not just treading water, but making the entire universe bigger and richer and developing new characters and stuff. But I also knew that people would immediately look at anything I wrote and say, is it the same as what Vince did? Which obviously it's not going to be, but is he deviating too much? And so I had, over that period of time, read Vince books over and over again, his original ones, because I thought I want to try and immerse myself in his version of Mitch Rapp, and just, so instead of it being a deviation to a deviation, to go back to the source and just like ingrain that in me. And so as I read those books, so Vince has a gap in his books between The Last Man and the book prior to that that's escaping me at the moment, where he went back and wrote American Assassin and Kill Shot. And so he took a pause, wrote those two books, and then came back and finished The Last Man, which was tragically the last book that he wrote. And so when I was looking at it, I'm like, and I read his entire series through completely and started to read him again. I thought, he had aged Mitch in real time with each of his books until he went back and wrote the two prequels. But he's got this gap now from when he started American Assassin and then Kill Shot, and then went back to current time, if you would, and wrote The Last Man. And I'm like, I wonder what happened during that time. And so I kind of figured out what it was. And lo and behold, it was the bin Laden raid. And so then I started thinking, I wonder what Vince thought of the bin Laden raid or what he said. And so I think you can find on his website, like one of the fan questions was actually that. What did Mitch Rapp do during the bin Laden raid? And so Vince appropriately talked about how certainly the glory hounds that were the Navy SEALs, now that might be my words and not his, the operators that went in and got bin Laden certainly did what they had to do and did the kinetic part. But as with any, joint operation, there was a lot of stage setting done by CIA officers beforehand to prepare the battlefield for those Navy SEALs. And he said something to the effect of, I would imagine Mitch Rapp probably had something to do with that, or that would be, what Mitch Rapp did. And so then I started thinking about it. And I'm like, you know what? It would be fun to go back to Vince's era of Mitch Rapp because, there were a lot of characters that Kyle justifiably had to move off the board, like Mike Nash and Stan Hurley. And I'm like, I could go visit a bunch of those characters. I could write in the time where Vince wrote. And so try and like I said, I'd been immersing myself in his version of Mitch Rapp. And I could take this pivotal moment in American history that obviously the readers were tongue in cheek asking about. And I could tell some of that story. And when you look at it, there are some really fascinating things that happened in the lead up to that bin Laden raid, right? And so the last book in my Matt Drake series, my fourth book, was called Forgotten War, and it happened during the fall of Afghanistan. And so in that one, I also used a real historical event that was kind of the metronome for the book, right? The fall of Afghanistan, the tragic deaths of those Marines and Navy folks who were killed during the suicide bomber. And so I had a little bit of experience doing that before. And I'm like, what if I did something similar to that? And so I pitched it to Emily. And Emily is an editor I'd wanted to work for forever. Everybody who writes for her loves her. And she was, to me, having not known her, was also very intimidating because she had, Vince Flynn and Brad Thor and all these amazing, this guy named Jack Carr, I don't know who he is, but she had all of these amazing writers. And so when it came time for me to say, hey, I've got an idea for the book, we did a Zoom call. And I'd never met her face to face. I didn't know her. And so I kind of started leading her down the path, and she was working from home and she was kind of pacing back and forth in the kitchen as I was talking. And again, trying to use my FBI human skills to look at her and say, is this resonating? And I'm like, I've completely lost her. Like, she hates this idea. And she's walking back and forth. And I finally wind down and I'm like, so that's it. And she looks up in the camera at me and she's like, I love it. Do it. And I'm like, I was a terrible agent. Like, first Kyle, then Emily Bestler. I'm horrible at this job. It's no wonder I got out. And so I got done with Emily, and then I had to have the same call with Sloan. And so it was over the phone. And so I couldn't get any visual cues at all. And so I get done with it, and Sloan, it's quiet for a minute. And Sloan's like, so is Mitch Rapp going to be in the stack behind Rob O'Neill? Is that what you're telling me right now? And I'm like, no, we're not. I don't think we're going to do that. But, here is where. And so he was supportive of it, but also I think a little bit more of, let's wait and see how this turns out. But it both of them, once they got my version, were incredibly supportive of it. Sloan sent me a really nice email. Emily sent me, as you know, she does smiley faces in the manuscript where she likes. And so there where I was counting the smiley faces. I'm like, I got 3 smiley faces in this section. I'm on fire. And so it was super neat, but I think it's also, I think when you're writing any kind of series, especially someone else's, you're always balancing 2 things. So on one hand, the fans come to that series for certain things. So if you're a Daniel Silva fan, you love seeing Gabriel Allon go head to head with the GOAT, right? Every time you wait for that part in the book to happen. And so you want to give the fans what they want. but you also don't want it to feel like it's Tuesday night and here's the next episode of the A-Team, right? Where the same thing happens at the same thing on time on that clock. And so you're always trying to balance those two. And I think one of the ways to do that or to not get stale is to take those super big swings, is to try something really, really hard that keeps you up at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking, can I pull this off? And Capture a Kill was certainly that for me.
Yeah, no, I think it was the right move. It was
Thank
fantastic.
you.
Great for people to be able to go back to that time. I think so. I think that part was genius and inspired
Thank you.
perfect, and that Vin Flynn would be proud of this book. Of course, when I get to the helicopter parts, I'm like, oh, talking about here. But in a more serious question, how hard was it to write Helicopter? This doesn't give too much away.
Sure.
Helicopters going down.
Yeah.
How tough was it? Or did you?
No, so that's something that's always hard for me that seems to make its way into each of my books. And I use the same call sign every time. It's always Turbine 33 because that was the call sign for the Chinook that was shot down in Operation Red Wings. And so it's always hard for me to write, but I think Nick Petrie, who's a friend of both of us, when I was kind of struggling after my third book didn't sell, he said, one of the things you have to do as a writer is put the stuff in the book that you're scared of, that wrenches your gut, that, makes you bleed onto that page. And so I think there's certainly a scene like that in Capture a Kill that very much mirrors a scene that happened in real life for me. And variations of that scene happen in a lot of my books. There's also something I started doing with my last Clancy book. With all of my books, I would put my friends in the books, and many of them were actual service members. I think it's kind of funny to change their branch affiliation a lot of times. So, for instance, in the Tom Clancy book, there is a Green Beret whose name is Jad, and Jad in real life is a Navy SEAL, and he doesn't like the fact that he's a Green Beret, but I think it's hilarious, and I leave him in there. And so in this book, there's a character who's an Army Ranger whose name is Mark Garner. And Mark in real life he and his beautiful wife Nikayla were our neighbors in Germany. He was he was Ranger qualified infantry officer. He wasn't from the Ranger Regiment. I made him that in this, but he when I rotated home from Germany, my last assignment was at the training center. I was the aviation planner. Mark had just taken over the company command of the OP4, the opposing force there. And so he had already been in the 82nd Airborne, had done tours of duty in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I believe. I know Iraq for sure. And so one of the things they do with that opposing force, even though they're an infantry battalion, and Mark was one of the company commanders in that battalion, is they rotate them a company at a time to Afghanistan and Iraq to keep their experience relevant. Because what the opposing force does in a training center is that when a unit comes in, usually prior to deployment, they go through an entire operation in this training center. And so that opposing force might be, if it's a National Guard unit, they might be a Serbian military unit, right, to get them ready for Kosovo. The next rotation, they might be the Taliban to get them ready to the unit to go to Afghanistan. The next rotation, they might be a Sunni militia to get the unit ready to go to Iraq, or they might be the Russian army in order to, if they're doing a force on force. And so Mark took his company to Afghanistan and was tragically killed in a roadside bombing. And so his wife, Nikayla, his widow, Nikayla, is an incredible woman who still lives in Germany to this day. She remarried a German guy. They have 3 small kids. Their first son, she named for Mark, his middle name Anders, and was actually born on Mark's birthday. And she still does grief counseling and teaches workshops in grief counseling for primarily military wives, but military spouses. And so I reached out to her and I said, hey, I'm doing this thing. I normally put in weapons grade, I actually put Shannon Kent, who is Joe Kent. Shannon Kent was a Navy cryptologist, but that doesn't do her justice. She has a phenomenal background. One of the first women, I think, to operationally work in JSOC. Her husband, Joe Kent, is a retired Green Beret. So I used her. I used a Green Beret staff sergeant that was killed in Nigeria. His name is Brian Black. His son is Isaac Black, and so I made him a character after asking his wife if I could do that. And so for Capture Kill, I wanted to do that with Mark. And so Nikayla very graciously did that. And so Mark's a character in that too. And so what I think when you're trying to tell a story, your first job is to tell a really compelling story that grips people. But I think if you have that life experience, if you know people who have lost their lives in combat, if you've had bad days, that you owe it to the reader to put that in the book, because I think readers recognize veracity, even if they don't know tactics, techniques, and procedures, even if they never served in combat a day. The emotions, hopefully, that are conveyed in that book resonate with the reader. And I think that's what we have to do as authors is kind of put your heart in the pages of the book you're writing.
I have a Send Me right over there, Marty's book about Shannon Kent, right over there.
Yep.
If people have not, I highly recommend they pick that up. Amazing story, tragic, but incredible, inspiring at the same time.
Yep.
So that's, yeah. So for people that don't know what we're talking about, you flew Apaches.
Yeah, I did.
How many years did you do that?
10 years. And so it was an amazing gig. It's hard to have a bad day when you get to fly Apaches. I did then my first assignment right out of flight school was, I think I commissioned, I think in 97, but then I didn't go on active duty until 98 because my flight school class got delayed. Or maybe something like that. Maybe I was 98 and I can't remember. Anyway, so my first assignment out of flight school was Korea, which back before the War on Terror, I think I was in Korea maybe in 99 because flight school is about 2 years long. It was a great job for a young lieutenant. I got to be a scout platoon leader, worked my way up to being a scout platoon leader, started as a staff guy and then was the attack platoon leader and then the scout platoon leader. Because back then, Korea kind of was the wild, wild west, where it's the closest you could get kind of to actual combat. And you're actually, aviation in the Army is different from aviation and the other services in that we are our own branch. And so what that means is that the Army looks at helicopters, especially Apaches, as if they're flying tanks. And so you learn, your job isn't just to support the ground maneuver forces. In Korea, especially, we were cavalry. And so you'd learn how to do zone and area reconnaissance and route reconnaissance. And you do practice doing these deep attacks where your job was to go get the second echelon Korean armor forces as they're flowing down to the DMZ and destroy them so that they can't reinforce the frontline units. And so it was a great first assignment for a junior officer. And then I went back to normal aviation at Fort Hood and then got to command a cavalry troop in Afghanistan as part of rotating to Germany. And so it was a really great career, and it was a great time. But by the time I'd hit my 10-year mark, we'd moved a total of 8 times in our first 10 years of marriage, and done a year in Afghanistan, which I have a lot of friends who from aviation end up going to special operations aviation units for a number of reasons, but one of them being that you don't deploy for a year at a time. Your deployments are much shorter and you get the dwell time. You know, if you're a 160th person, you're probably at either Fort Campbell or Savannah, one of the two. And so you don't have to PCS, you don't have to do that. And so for me, with small kids and everything at that 10-year mark, I just spent a year away from my family and decided I had been a commander, had done the thing that I'd wanted to do, and it was time to get out. But it was flying Apaches. It was a great gig.
I forget, you start with like a fixed wing of some sort before you fly for the first time, or is that?
Yeah. Yeah. I believe the Navy and the Air Force both do it that way, where you fly fixed wing trainers first. So in the Army, the trainer back then was the OH-58, which is kind of the Jet Bell Ranger, but it was the old Alpha Charlie 58s. The one that you saw like in Iraq and somewhat in Afghanistan with the ball on top was the 08-58 Delta. And it has 4 blades and much more modern airframe. The one that we flew were the old Alpha Charlie ones. And so you fly that first and you go all the way through flight school. And then you would, after you earned your wings, you would get what was called the transition course. And so there'd be an order of merit list and you would put what helicopter you wanted. And then it was kind of where you were in your class rank and what the Army needed depending on what helicopter you got. And so you would go to what's called the AQC, or the Aircraft Qualification Course. The Apache is the longest one. And that's because number one, it's a very complicated aircraft, has a very complex mission, but it also is the only aircraft where you fly out of your right eye. There's a little monocle that goes over your eye. And so it's attached to a sensor pod at the front of the helicopter. And so as you turn your head, that turns and you fly out of that eye. And then you use your left eye to look inside the cockpit at the instruments and stuff. And so it's very, very difficult. I actually failed my first progress ride it's called Fly in the Bag, and I had to get extra hours and then retake the test. But it's the way they teach you is that your instructor pilot sits in the front cockpit and you fly during the day, and then you sit in the back cockpit and they take high-tech black hefty trash bags and tape it to the cockpit so that you can't see outside, and it forces you to use the system, and you're flying during the daytime so that your instructor pilot can keep you from killing yourself. But you know, at first, especially the older model Apaches, you had to constantly tune the level and gain on that sensor, because over time there's something that's called thermal crossover. That means that as the day goes on or night goes on, things cool and heat at different temperatures. And so what looks like a runway might actually be the grass, because they've hit the point where there's thermal crossover and you can't tell the difference. And so in Afghanistan, even, we had the older system. And so you figured out pretty quickly at night, you could tune your thermal for one of two things, because your flying formation blacked out, which is its own incredibly scary thing, where you have no position lights, you're completely blacked out. And so you could tune it most times to either see the helicopter or to see the ground, but you couldn't see both at the same time. And so you had to decide, am I going to fly formation really tight and just tune it to see that helicopter, or am I going to back off more and tune it so that I can see the outline and the terrain ahead of me instead? And so it was thankfully the sensors are much, much better now, but it was very long class or course in order to get your qualification, and not uncommon for folks to get recycled like I was for different things in that course, because it's such a demanding aircraft to fly.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure the sensors are pretty wild now with all the upgrades, but the first Apaches came out a long time ago. And that was the big thing, was that was like so high tech, where you turn your head, I think Army, it was like a selling point to come to the Army, like, use this new technology, is amazing. And that was what year the first Apache was fielded, I'm not sure, but testing that went up for that commissioning of that bird, or whatever it's called.
Yeah, I think it was developed in the 70s and then fielded in the late 70s, early 80s. So it was some old technology. And to your point, for folks who haven't used night vision devices before, so night vision goggles are very, very good if there's some amount of illumination. And so, if you have even just a sliver of a moon, they're fantastic, right? And I kind of referenced that in the book. Thermals are really don't rely on ambient light. And so they're very, very good in, no moon nights or in a cave or something like that. But what we started doing in Afghanistan is you'd have the front seater would fly with goggles and the back seater would fly with the system. And so a lot of, like, guys like you, if we were supporting a SEAL team, a lot of times they'd use a command pointer or something, a laser, to say, shoot this. Well, the front seater could see that because he or she was under goggles, but the back seater couldn't. And so when we would shoot, oftentimes the front seater would have the gun, and he would look where the SEAL team was pointing and put 30 millimeter rounds on that target. And then me, as the backseater, I would have the rockets. And so I'd watch where those rounds were hitting and then turn and just put rockets on top of that. And so now, like we were saying, the optics are much, much better. And I think they either have a compilation of both of those systems, or they can switch back and forth. But it was very much still kind of the wild, wild west back in 2005, 2006.
love in here. You've got the DAP in here as well. I like
Yes.
that. That back to memories of those in Afghanistan in particular. How much do you think that Red Wings played into you getting out and moving on? And of course, you don't really get out. You
Yeah.
go to work. You don't make a clean. That's not a clean break, I don't think. But how much did Red Wings play into you getting out?
So that's a good question because it was the funny thing about when you have a bad day in the military when you're in is you're surrounded by people who have also had bad days. And so you don't really it's unusual, I guess, but not that unusual, right? It's not, especially back then when you or I were in there, the people were in Iraq were just getting blown up by IEDs. We're having, it was not uncommon for everybody to have some kind of story. And so for me, I don't think it was a big factor in getting out. If anything, it probably made me second guess my decision to get out because again, and like I've shared with you before, I felt like that was the moment in time that I had trained my entire life for, and it went sideways and I couldn't get it back. And I was never going to get the chance to fly in combat again. And so that was my one chance. I'm done with Afghanistan. I don't have any way to atone from the fact that it went sideways. And so I don't think that it was a driver for me getting out, but what it did do is that when you're a veteran, there are a couple things you don't realize until you separate from the service. And so the first one being you don't realize that how much of you is rolled up in what you do, that you are defined by the fact that, in my case, I'm an Apache pilot because you've worked so hard to earn those wings, to earn the right to fly that helicopter. It's something not everybody can do. And that is who you are. You are a gunship pilot. And then when you leave and you hang up your helmet and you're not that anymore, it's this crazy dissonance where I got to work for a fantastic company, but I went from, chasing bad guys across Afghanistan a year or so prior to sitting in a cubicle just like all these other guys. And I'd never been like all those other guys. I was a freaking Apache pilot, and now I'm just another dude sitting in a cubicle. And so it's hard to kind of come to terms with that. I think the second thing is you don't realize how much of a sense of purpose serving in the military gives you because those words that get used a lot now, things like selfless service, that putting your battle buddy before you, that being connected to something bigger than you take that for granted in the military because that's your life until you leave that and realize the rest of the world isn't like that. And then the third thing that you kind of alluded to for Red Wings is that when you leave, you separate yourself from the community of people who understand what you went through and can talk to you about it, and to a community of people who are very well meaning but have no basis for understanding what you went through and what you're dealing with right now. And it's this very insidious thing where you're surrounded by people who have stories with you that can, you can have a beer and talk about your bad days, to nobody knows what you went through. Nobody's done that before. And so those three things together, I think it is not any surprise that the veteran suicide rate is as high as it tragically is, because people isolate and you don't even realize it. I remember my mom, as I was getting ready to get out of the army, she asked me, she's like, what if you don't like your civilian job? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I just spent a year in Afghanistan. How bad could this be? Not realizing that it wasn't that did I like my job or not? It's that you're having an identity crisis. You're trying to supplement this thing that has been your purpose in life for, on my case, a decade, and figuring out what in the world can I ever do that's going to matter as much as that did. And then the third one being, if you had that bad day, trying to come to terms with it because now you're forced to, but not having a community of people around you that can help you navigate that. And it is those three things together, I think, are a very dangerous brew.
People want to know exactly what happened. They can listen to our first podcast about that. We go into great detail about that time. Do you think you'll ever write about it other than through fiction?
I don't know. I think there have been other people who have written about it, and I think my piece of it is very small. You know, it's a sliver. Like you and I had talked about before, I wasn't even supposed to be on that mission. It was happenstance that I was on QRF at the time. So I think I certainly have part of the story to tell, but not enough to my best friend who's also in this book, Kelsey Smith, is he and I were troop together, commanders together in Afghanistan, and he stayed in, retired as a full bird colonel a little bit ago. I had to call him up as I was writing sections of Capture or Kill because I wanted to show what Apaches did and do an area reconnaissance, and so he had to talk me through that again. And he had been after me for a while he's like, look, once Red Wings happened and then it went to the recovery, because there were no Cobra gunships, they had moved out. Our Apaches were the gunships for the Marines that were going in to secure the crash site. He has a very unique perspective on different things that happened there. And he's like, we could gather all the guys together and you could write this. And I don't know that I'm the best person to tell that story because of some of the distant stuff. And you and I have talked about before that I got to know Mike Murphy's family a bit. Mike Murphy's dad invited me last year to come up. Every 2 years, they do a gala where they do a big fundraiser for the Murphy Foundation. If you're in Long Island, everybody should go check out the Mike Murphy Museum because it's incredible. It's a museum to being a SEAL, first of all, but then it has an actual terrain model of that mountaintop in Afghanistan, and you can see exactly what happened and with a scary amount of detail. And so he invited me to come back and talk, and he said, "Hey, will you just come back and share your version of what happened at Red Wings?" And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I don't think I've talked about it a bunch of times, but standing up there that night, and everybody was completely gracious. I don't mean to imply that at all, but like I can see I'm sitting with Mike's little brother and his wife. I can see Mike's mom in front of me. That the audience is full of SEALs, because they all had amazing hair, but they had, even the ones that were out of uniform, they're wearing their tridents on their suit. There are a ton of Gold Star moms there. There are a bunch of extortion moms who were there and stuff. And so to get up and tell this story where, in my mind still, I'm like, I failed those guys. I didn't get the job done. I didn't, stop the shoot down from happening. And like, I'm telling that story to a bunch of moms who have lost their sons, to a bunch of, some of them wives who don't have husbands there, to a bunch of SEALs, some of them who were there. And afterwards, like I said, everybody was great. And I got mommed by a whole bunch of moms that didn't have boys to hug anymore. And so, but that takes something out of you. And so to think of like sitting and writing about it, even though my part in it was very small, but to pull all that together, I don't think I could do that.
How do you think that impacted you personally and professionally? Not right after, but how does it continue to affect you today as a husband, father, citizen, author?
Yeah, so my son is about to be commissioned next month. He's against everything I could do. He drank the Kool-Aid and is being commissioned as a Marine Corps officer. And he didn't win an ROTC scholarship. Texas is fantastic. Like, Texas is so pro-military that they have a series of scholarships where every state or federal elected office in Texas, like the state congressman, the state, whatever, the federal senators and Congress people, can give a kid a scholarship, a $10,000 a year scholarship, if they want to go in the military as an officer afterwards. And so he won one of those scholarships. And then the Marines do it a little bit differently than the Army do. So you have ROTC scholarships, and then you also have something that's called the PLC, and I think it's called the Platoon Leaders Class or Platoon Leaders Course. And so basically anybody off the street, in fact, Vince Flynn tried to do this and was medically disqualified. He was trying to get an aviation contract in the Marines. You can go to officer candidate school. And so the second half of officer candidate school is where the ROTC kids go and everything. And I'm sure it's still difficult. But the first part of officer candidate school is where, if you're prior service and you want to go officer candidate school, if you're a kid off the street who makes the order of merit list and gets selected, you go to officer candidate school. And so my son did that, and he was in the Corps Cadets from Texas A&M, and they did the very best that they could to prepare him for that. But about midway through that officer candidate school, he gave me a call and he's like, Dad, I don't know that I can do this. I don't, it's the, he was on the brink of trying to, for the first time in his life, and he's 21 years old, looking down into his soul and saying, do I have what it takes to do this? And what I offered him that I'll talk about here was, there's a reason why it needs to be as hard as it is on you right now. And you're not going to realize this now or in 10 years from now, but God willing, someday you might have a son or daughter who decides to go into the military. And only then will you realize that the trust that American moms and dads put into you as a young lieutenant, when they entrust to you the most valuable thing in the world to them, that is their son and daughter. And you need to be worthy of that, because you might have to lead them in combat. And combat it's not always like the movies. It doesn't always go great. There aren't always happy endings. And so you have to, as a leader, know that you have done everything you can do at the end of that. And you need to be worthy of the men and women that you lead. That's one of my favorite books. When people ask me what it was like to serve in Afghanistan or in the global war of terror, I always point them to Sean Parnell's book that's called Outlaw Platoon. Because Sean does such a fantastic job of not chest pounding. And he was just a infantry platoon leader. He wasn't a special operations guy. But what comes through in that book is the sense of responsibility that Sean feels for the men that he's been given to lead in combat. And so I think, for me, what Red Wings did is gave me that perspective that this is what it means to lead men and women in combat. Sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes it's completely out of the control. But the way that I think the only way that you're able to look at yourself in the mirror afterwards is to think, I, as a leader, did everything that I could in that point. I did everything I could to be prepared for it. I did it. And sometimes the coin toss still doesn't go your way, right? And you're going to have to figure out a way to live with that. But that, I think, was what Red Wings drove home to me. And what I tried to tell my son is, like, there is a reason why they are trying to weed you out. He had, I think, right about a 50% attrition rate in his OCS class. It was a lot of different things, between injuries, between all of that. And I'm like, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why, you were from the special operations community. People talk about being 2 or 3 times volunteers, right? Like, you volunteer for the service, you volunteer for airborne school, you volunteer to become a SEAL or a Ranger and stuff, because you want to know that the men, and in some cases women, on either side of you are just as committed as you are. Because when your back is against the wall, you want to know that that person has gone through just as rigorous as a crucible as you have. And I think that's what I tried to impress upon my son.
And that's great advice and plea for anyone. And yeah, please give him my best, by the way.
Yeah, we'll do.
And so, kind of parallel to that, when you look at post-military time and going to that, and then going to the FBI, and then going to private sector consulting, and then moving into publishing, is there anything you would have done differently, like broad strokes, that might help somebody else that's making that transition? Not really from the military, maybe, but maybe it's just a job transition, or death of a loved one, a divorce, or whatever transition you're going to have in life. Yours, when you're looking at that military transition, obviously that's the the framework with which we can look at these things. Is there anything you would have done differently looking back, now that you're a decade plus removed from it, but then you have another transition from FBI, out in publishing? What would you have done differently, or is there anything? And what do you think is your most valuable lesson learned?
Yeah, so I think the first part of the question, to what we were discussing before, you need to stay connected to a community of veterans if you were a veteran, right? I've been very fortunate that My best friends now are folks who could be and sometimes are against their wishes characters in my book. And so I have a very good friend I met in Ohio who works for Procter and Gamble, and he sells diapers. For a while he sold diapers, and the world needs diapers. I was a young kid, or when I was a young father and we had kids, I was very glad that somebody made high quality diapers. But for me, and for a lot of folks who have come out of the military and stuff, you need something that gives you that greater sense of purpose, that connection back to that life you had before. And so for me, I was able to find that in the FBI, and then find it again. As you mentioned, I spent, before I got to write full time, I spent the next 10 or 12 years working in the defense business. And my customers, I knew that when I did my job well, that the things that we were giving to people who would go downrange and use them, it would save their lives. And so for me, that was that connection point back to, number one, that higher purpose, and number two, to the men and women I still cared about who were still doing the things that I thought were important. And so that's how, and in fact, I think you and I were talking about it when we were in the Poison Pen. I got the opportunity to work as a consultant a little bit for the company. That was my full-time job before I went writing, just because I still wanted to have that connection to those people, because I didn't realize how much listening to their stories filled my tank as a writer and gave me more things to talk about and more things to write in my own book. I think from a general piece of advice or things that I would do different, when I was looking at leaving the company that I was working with right after I got out of the Army, when I was thinking about going to the FBI. So I had 3 very small kids. My wife and I were high school sweethearts. We'd moved home. Both of our parents lived 2 miles away. Her sister did. And we lived in a great house. I was making great money. I knew I'd have to take about a 25 or 30% pay cut. We'd have to move across the country to somewhere we'd never been. All of those things that were reasons why I should stay, and why I was thinking, maybe I should just suck it up. Like, maybe as a man, as a father, I should just suck it up and hate this part of my life and try and find fulfillment somewhere else. And so one of the people who worked at this company was a mentor of mine. He was a believer. He's Brazilian. Classic immigrant story, came to the US at 18 with barely any money in his pocket, went to the University of Pennsylvania on a scholarship, became an engineer, worked at this company, was doing really well. And so I went to him and I said, hey, Dennis, here's what I'm thinking of doing. Am I crazy? Should I just suck it up for my family? Should I put this part of me aside and just say, you had your fun for 10 years, you did this, it didn't matter anymore? And I will never forget what he said to me. And he said, where I am in my life right now, and he was in his probably mid to late 50s. He said, my kids are graduated. I'm in the twilight of my career. I'm kind of on the downward slope, if you will. Not that that's a bad thing, but he had reached that part in his life that was the twilight. And he said, when I look back at my life, and I'd had a pretty amazing life. He said, when I came to the US, I barely even spoke English. And now I have an engineering degree. I work at this great company. He said, my biggest regrets are not when things that I tried went sideways. He said, it's when I looked at something and I refused to swing at that pitch because I was scared of what would happen if I swung and I struck out. And he said, I think you should do this. I think you should go chase this thing because it's big and it's scary, and it may not turn out all right, but this is who you are, and this is what you're wired to do. And what you don't want to be is 58 or 59 years old looking back and thinking, man, I wonder what my life would have been if I would have tried this crazy thing. So I think about that a lot when I look at opportunities now. At that same company, there was a vice president that came. I got the company I worked for, they like to bring military officers in and kind of run them through a leadership development program for 2 years before they set them free in the business. And so when he was talking to a bunch of us in this leadership development program, he said, the way I look at future jobs now, or future career opportunities, is if it doesn't make me want to throw up because I'm so scared of whether I will be able to pull it off or not. And he's like, I don't do it. And I thought, Isn't that a great way to look at your life? Because it's you were a Navy SEAL, right? You say all the time, never tell me the odds, but the majority of people who try that, they don't make it through, right? And if you would have let that dictate your decision making, that the odds are I'm probably not going to make it through. The odds are I'm probably not going to be a published writer. The odds are I'm not, right? For any of us. And does it work out all the time? No, it didn't work out a bunch of times for me. And there were times where I'm looking at the ceiling at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking I gave up what was safe and what was stable and what was easy for my family to chase this thing. And now it might not work out. And what did I do? Right. But when I look back, I wouldn't change any of that, because each of those decisions has allowed me to do what I'm doing now. And so I think that would be, as somebody who is now in his 50s, that would be my advice to younger folks starting out, is like, man, take those big swings, because it's easier to deal with striking out than it is to be regretful that you didn't have the courage to swing.
Man, I love it. Swung big with this, man.
Thanks, man.
Awesome. Absolutely love it. Once again, like I said before, Vince Flynn would be proud of this. I can't wait for it to get to the shelves, which when this podcast comes out, it'll be out. So definitely check this out. You can tease this a little bit. I didn't want to go into too much detail.
Yeah.
We give some little hints here and there, but what is next that can you hint at is next for Mitch Rapp?
Oh man. He will continue. I can't hint at anything yet for what is next.
End of every James Bond movie. James Bond will return. You know?
He will be back. Mitch Rapp will be back.
Oh man, I love it. And then anything outside the Mitch Rapp universe, Vince Flynn's universe, that you are excited about, whether it's publishing or not? Like, what projects are out there after you've done all these amazing things as an Apache pilot, as an FBI agent, and now in publishing with your own books with Tom Clancy, here with Vince Flynn and Capture or Kill? What other projects that you have on your list that you want to take a swing at?
Yeah, so I'm working on something of mine now too. So I'm writing the Mitch Rapp books, and super blessed to be able to do that. And it allows me to slow down. For a while, I was on that book every 5 months pace, and so I'm slowing down a little bit, but I'm still working on something of mine, and I hope to have that finished maybe, I don't know, next 7 or 8 months or so. So we'll see.
I love it. And then for aspiring writers, authors out there, you get this question probably all the time, but you never know something new that someone hasn't heard out there yet. When people ask you about writing and they're aspiring and they want to be in your shoes someday and they're looking up to you, what do you pass on?
Yeah, so a lot of people come and talk to me, and they say, and I get to be an adjunct writing instructor now at the university where I got my MFA, which is really fun. But when they talk to me about it, they tell me about their project, or this is what I'm going to do, and I say, okay, that's great. Tell me what books yours would be shelved next to. Like, what are the best sellers in your genre right now that your book would be on the shelf with? I mean, if they can't answer that, to me, they haven't done their homework yet. And so part of this gig is about being a great writer for sure. But the other part is that we have to become experts in the genre that we're trying to publish into. Because, if you set aside writing books, if we were making furniture and you're trying to sell a chest of drawers, you have to know what kind of wood do people like? How many drawers is it? What are the clasps on there? Are they brass, metal, what colors? And so I'm never going to write, Brad Taylor and Mark Graney were both kind of big brothers to me as I was coming up, and they're both fantastic writers, but I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor or Mark Graney book than Brad or Mark did. And so for me, without sanction, I had to know, here are the top writers in this genre right now, and here are the things that I'm doing that are the same but different. So my book should be shelved, hopefully next to Brad and Mark's, but here are the choices I made in my book that's different from theirs. And the only way you get that is through that knowledge of the genre. Like, you put out reading lists and stuff all the time. You have to, if you write in this genre, you should be able to talk talk about who originally invented the genre. How did it change under Tom Clancy after 9/11? How did it change again? Who is the next generation of writers who are doing things? Because it's your job, if you're writing commercial fiction, to understand that the market you're trying to sell to.
Yeah, no, absolutely understand the history of the genre, and I'm always surprised at how many people don't look into that fact ahead of time, or isn't a part of their experience as a reader. So, man, well, thank you so much for spending this time. I sincerely appreciate it. Always great to see you, and also thank you for coming down to Poison Pen and doing a little gig with me for Red Sky Morning not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. And right here, Capture or Kill, right here. Vince Flynn, and you are continuing this legacy. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Appreciate all you've done. Appreciate your friendship, and hopefully we'll get together again here pretty soon.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jack.
Take care.
Thank you for joining the Jack Carr Book Club. The September 2024 Book of the Month is my first work of nonfiction, Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror. Written with Pulitzer Prize finalist and historian James Scott. Go to officialjackcar.com to learn more, including where you can add these book club selections to your library for 15% off while supporting independent bookstores. Be sure to join me and fellow authors and readers at Jack Carr Book Club on Instagram. And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until we turn the next page, stay sharp, stay true, and keep reading.